All right. So good morning. My name is Lloyd Lindley with Political Science 6310. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with the CEO of Houston Area Women's Center, Miss Emilee Whitehurst. We thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. So today we're just basically going to ask you a few questions, and about your leadership style, especially during this pandemic, these times. Question number one is basically, what do you think are the three best attributes that a great leader should display when leading an organization through adversities such as Hurricane Harvey or COVID-19?
Well, that's a great question. And, I think the context has to determine in many ways how you respond. And yet there probably are some kind of consistent characteristics or leadership qualities that, you need to be able to bring to bear to any situation. I can tell you, in this situation, we have had some really unique challenges at this organization that have stretched my leadership for sure. We are a domestic violence and sexual assault agency, the premier agency. And so in the midst of this pandemic, when the orders were understandably for public health reasons to stay home, what we knew is that was going to likely put many of the kinds of clients that we see and serve in greater danger. Isolation compounds the violence, and for the largely women and children that we see, being quarantined with an abuser was only going to put them in further jeopardy. And yet, while we knew we were going to be on the front lines of what was going to, in our arena, be an escalating crisis, it was really challenging to figure out how to get the word out about that in a way that didn't controvert the public health advice. And part of what we, and I'm getting to one of the characteristics here, I'm trying to tell it through a story. And part of the way that I think we were able to very effectively do that is by lifting up the teammates who are on the front lines of working with our clients. And so the leadership quality there, in my opinion, is, it's a number of things. One is really honoring and respecting the people who are doing the work, and putting their and the people who are needing, obviously the people who need the services, but the people, in our case, the people who were doing the work were in many ways functioning as first responders. You were seeing stories about workers in the hospital, or concerns about protective equipment for police and for firefighters. But here in our case, we were we were continuing to house people. We were dealing with escalating hotline calls, putting people in hotels who couldn't find shelter, and increasing numbers. And part of how we were able to, I think, break through all of the pandemic noise to begin to tell the story of this domestic violence rise was by telling the story of the people who were doing the work, who were, in my opinion, first responders. They were functioning as first-line crisis response advocates, and in many ways, they were risking their own lives by by putting themselves in the wake of they were not quarantining at home, in other words. And we worked with to make sure that when the state shut down, we had a special dispensation to allow our staff to continue to work, to be out and driving around. But what that meant was that I had to be able to, and we as a leadership team had to be able to really pay attention to the moment, and foreground the work of our staff and the courage of our staff, and position this agency very intentionally as part of an active effort to address a co-occurring pandemic, which was that of a rising cases of domestic violence. And I think we did that through telling the story of the people who were, showing up at the shelter, showing up at the hotels, answering calls, and that was a really powerful way, because there was in some ways kind of a turning point for this agency. When Houston experienced Hurricane Harvey, this agency was also very clear that we were going to experience a dramatic escalation in domestic violence and likely in homicides. And sure enough, in the year following Harvey, the statistics showed a 45% increase in homicide rates for women. What we were able to do this time, I think, is leverage that information and really foreground our staff as first responders and really help orchestrate, thanks to the leadership of the mayor and other really essential city council leaders, a much more comprehensive, collaborative partnership between our agency, other domestic violence agencies in the city to address the rising rates of domestic violence along with the concerns about the pandemic. So, you know, lifting up the work that your staff is doing, celebrating them, making sure their story gets told, and then reading the moment and trying to make sure that the work that we're doing articulate how that work is relevant and why it's so essential at this time.
Okay.
And good data, you know, data is a challenge, but trying to really make sure we could accurately reflect what was happening on the ground.
Okay, and that almost leads us into the next question. So I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the questions is how has COVID-19 impacted the way the Houston Area Women's Center caseworkers come in contact with victims during these times?
Well, it's changed a lot in many ways, and I will say there have been some benefits to it for our clients. We had been planning as part of our strategic plan to increase our mobile advocacy, which is our way of saying making sure that our teammates and advocates go to where the clients are rather than expecting them to come to us. And certainly technology is a big help in that endeavor. Never did we imagine that we would be doing that over the course of 35 to 45 days. But once it was clear that we needed to radically reimagine how, in very short order, how we were delivering our services, particularly the non-residential services. And for us, that's counseling, legal advocacy, case management, economic empowerment, financial coaching, a whole host of services that we offer free for clients who are in the wake of trauma, rebuilding their lives. Our housing program, all those programs needed to basically go virtual. And so, but in our case, part of the concern there is that many times technology is a tool of the abuser or the perpetrator. And so we had to figure out all the security concerns and make sure that our staff were aware of how these platforms can be hacked or abused, so that they could advise the clients on how to keep themselves safe if they were to use these platforms. So they had to become tech experts, and we had we just were able to switch. Basically, we have now I think we're about 140, almost 150 staff members, and roughly half of those went virtual, if not more, within a month or two, to deliver services virtually. And what that has allowed the clients to do is access services without having to come to the building, which in many ways was what we had hoped for initially when we imagined this mobile advocacy. For the clients that are getting residential services, those modifications have been different. We've had to, in effect, instead of running one shelter, we're now running 3, because we deconcentrated the campus. And so in order to honor social distancing guidelines and build in the capacity for quarantining or self-isolation for family units, we couldn't have the 120 people on our campus that we typically do, give or take. We reduced the census on that campus to 75, and so then are supplementing with 2 other hotel locations. So, I would say in terms of a leadership lesson there, it's just being able to be flexible and nimble. And another thing is really trying to drive those decisions as close to the ground as possible. So I wasn't the one trying to dictate how we would do that service delivery model. Those decisions were coming from the staff who would be delivering the service. what technology would use, how we would incorporate that technology for the clients, when we would roll out what service depending on our capacity. I was briefed, I was included, I was informed, and I would ask questions, leading and probing questions. But the decision-making process really needed to be driven, and I talk about that, driving that as close to the ground as possible. That's not my idea, that's some sort of management thing. But anyways, it really is true, especially in the middle of a pandemic, when the people doing the work who are the experts. And so really trusting them. And sometimes, it's not always how I would have liked it to happen, or it wasn't the right, wasn't the order that I would like to see it in, but I was wrong, probably, right? And so, knowing how to support the people who in the agency are the experts in their service line and empowering them to make those decisions.
Trusting the staff around you. I know
yeah, absolutely. And we are just so blessed here to have an amazing team. So I can do that with full confidence.
You're only as strong as your team, definitely.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
All right. One of the questions also is, and you hit this topic already, but basically it's asking, with the increase of domestic violence during the pandemic and the cutbacks HAWC had to make, how has your leadership had to adjust, adapt, and be proactive to remain a leading resource for domestic violence victims within our community?
Yeah. So, I will tell you, typically, I like to lead by engaging with people personally and in person. I get a lot of my intuitive information about how to guide the agency in my capacity from being in contact with people and from being out and about in contact with people. So I will tell you the kind of constriction of my universe, not only with respect to the staff and the team, but to the clients and to the community at large, has been a real challenge. It has felt like a little bit like I'm, flying with blinders on. I really don't feel like I can see as clearly about how things are going and what's happening. And it's hard to know where to get reliable or credible information about what's the real deal, right? Because everything is filtered through a screen. And so that's been a real challenge. And also, I'm a doer. I like to go out and do, and sort of to have a day where, my productivity really is Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting after, and, blocks of emails. It's really that's been an adjustment. But the principles of just trying to make sure that you're deeply listening, and supporting, deeply listening, and then trying to, whatever you want to call it, read the tea leaves and make those kind of judgment calls about which direction we need to go. That process has to go on. So, we've tried to implement different ways for the leaders of the agency to stay connected. I do, we have all staff meetings on Zoom. I meet with each departments regularly. I have gone ahead and done site visits, fairly regularly. I have a kind of a regular cadence I'm trying to build in of visiting our 3 residential locations. I do come into the office periodically. I'm here now. But I think it has been, there is a real loss of connection and kind of esprit de corps, I think, for our agency, and figuring out how to address that morale issue is something that we're continually trying to be creative with. And that, our workforce is largely female, and many of them are moms, and the challenge of, I know this applies to me, of managing childcare and online schooling while working full time. We've had to really lean into a different way of thinking about work hours, and the work is already so challenging, and maintaining appropriate boundaries for people with respect to the clients they're serving, and then their ability to kind of manage their own emotional well-being and not sort of get secondary trauma from that kind of daily exposure to such severe harm that people have experienced, that they're sort of helping witness and accompany people along their way. But then, before, if they were doing that at the office, there was a way they could go home and leave it at work, or, those kinds of tools that people had in their tool belt to manage that daily stress and trauma that they experienced from doing this work. That all got upended. So, we've really had to think differently about how to be a team in this moment. And I think I'm not sure it will ever go back to the way it was, honestly. I think there will be dimensions of this that we will continue to incorporate and learn from, because also people are appreciating not having to drive into the office. They are liking that non-commute piece.
Yes, definitely. Well, I know you touched on this too. I know briefly, one of our final questions basically is, with all the restrictions and guidelines accompanying the COVID-19 pandemic, has it been difficult for HAWC to connect with clients in suitable transitional shelter? And what have you done to meet the long-term house needs of victims who have been forced to flee their abusers?
Well, our primary commitment is to provide safety on demand to people who are fleeing violence. And we do that primarily through our hotline, but we also get referrals from partners and from in the city of Houston, depending on from the city of Houston, hospitals, police. We get referrals from a whole host of places, but primarily these calls come through our hotline. Mm-hmm. And even prior to the pandemic, we unfortunately and tragically are regularly having to turn away people. We have a tool that we use to assess people's danger. And that is an evidence-based tool. It's very useful. It helps gauge, and it helps the person in that experience who in many ways is so used to coping and getting by to kind of reflect on some of what's been happening. And it also helps our advocates get a sense of, and it's questions like, does your partner have a gun? Has your partner threatened to kill you? Has your partner threatened to commit suicide? Are you pregnant? Things that we know can become pretty significant indicators of risk for increasing levels of violence. And we regularly, even for people who we know we have concerns for their safety, have to turn people away. That was prior to the pandemic. And so in some ways, because there have been increasing dollars and this wonderful collaboration that's come about through the city and the county, and in the wake of this pandemic, we have been able to front load some money to just continue to put more and more people as needed into shelter and hotels. So our ability to provide safety on demand, thankfully, has increased during this time. There's been many nights where we've housed more people than ever before because we were not limited to even though on our residential campus there were less, in the aggregate we were housing more people. So I'm really proud of that. I'm incredibly proud of our team who's worked so hard to respond to the need. In the long run, I think we have big plans to expand our campus because we need more space to attend to people who are fleeing. And then we need a kind of housing that allows them to bridge from being homeless, in effect, when you're fleeing violence, you're homeless, and to getting into permanent housing that is a long-term safe solution for them. So that's our vision. And we've gotten some city dollars, $15 million from the city to do that. And we'll have to raise probably double as much to match it. But we really are committed to doing that. And I think part of what we want to be able to do is, and this pandemic is an opportunity to really tell that story, is how homelessness and violence and disasters are connected, and the need for supportive housing for people who have been traumatized and abused is so critical. So that's what we want to do. Yeah.
Okay, that is extremely helpful. And finally, this is a big question for my group and I. What advice would you give someone that's wanting to start a nonprofit and be a leader, show the leadership traits or qualities to be in the nonprofit sector?
Well, I think the nonprofit sector is not just one thing. I think there are many different types of nonprofits, and there's many different roles that nonprofits can play. So I think some of that would be a real sort of values clarification for that person about what is their interest, what is really driving them to get into that sector. If they're wanting to make, systems change, like really get at the root causes of the disparities that are forcing people to turn to nonprofits for services in the first place. Mm-hmm. A nonprofit can be part of that solution, but it's not going to be the whole of it. So while, I think that trying to find out whether what you're wanting to do is do agitation activism work, and making sure that's not always the same as working in a nonprofit. And also figuring out how nonprofits can be better at doing more of that agitating and advocacy. And not on all profits are the same. In the case of the Visionary Women's Center, it was really founded out of a movement against violence, and a real sensibility that there are, there are root causes that are at play here that need to get addressed. And so there's this kind of ethos of telling the truth. For example, as long as women get less pay systematically and women of color get even less, it's really farcical to talk about women not being able, women leaving their abusers when they can't even earn what they need to earn to live an independent life. And so we can sit here and serve people who are fleeing forever, but if we're not talking about wage equity, and we're not talking about racial disparities, and we really are, I think, being doing our services in an unethical way. But that's not every nonprofit, and I think, and to truth be told, in our case, there are certain issues and certain things that we don't, frankly, and many times just don't have the time to take on, because the burden of navigating government grants and maintaining payroll for all that staff does become its own objective. So this tension between really trying to figure out how to change systems while also serving those that are being negatively impacted from the systems that we're trying to change, that to me is the real, existential question for somebody. I would hope somebody would wrestle with when they're thinking about going to nonprofit. Don't pretend that by going to the nonprofit you're going to fix the problems, because this the system has figured out a way to have nonprofits and not actually make any real change. So if we want to have real change, we can't keep doing nonprofits the way we've been doing them, or maybe nonprofit's not the place to do it. I think we have to really look at that. Because what's got to happen is, we have to be as committed to shutting our doors as we are to providing the services, which is really hard. I'm going to just tell you that's really hard, because I've got people whose livelihood depends on me, and I've got people who are turning to us to flee, who are fleeing violence, and I can't shut the doors, but I also can't, not do what we need to do to address those root causes. So what do you do? And those are the real hard questions I think people who want to be in the nonprofit sector should look at. Otherwise, you're just getting a job. And you might as well, if that's the case, might as well get a job that's going to pay you more. But if you're really ready to wrestle with what's going down, then do it, but don't delude yourself. There are some ways in which nonprofits are complicit in the problems that we are pretending to address.
Absolutely. That's the chapter that we just completed, is like, confronting the actual issue at hand, observing that, hey, there is a problem. Now how can, sometimes you have to make the people uncomfortable or ask the uncomfortable questions in order to, get to the resolution that you like. So
yeah. And absolutely. And when you're leading an agency that is now looked to and counted on and has government dollars attached to it, how do you keep doing that? I mean, you need to keep doing it, but how do you keep doing that?
Right, absolutely. Oh, well, I definitely do thank you for your time. You gave us some gems, some great information. I wish much success for you guys. Of course,
thank you.
Like I said, big thing, especially with this month being Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So
thank you.
Thank you so much, Emilee, for your time, and you guys have a wonderful day.
You too. You take care.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.